welcome to the Beyond the Device podcast, where we explore the life-defining moments that shape careers within the medical device industry. We are particularly interested in understanding how personal experiences, challenges, or pivotal events influence professional journeys. And as we progress through the conversation, we will eventually land on the question, what is the one defining moment or experience in your life that changed everything for you and then set you on the path that you're onto today? Today's guest is someone that has extensive experience in medical device development. They've worked across surgical, respiratory, and drug delivery devices, managing engineering teams and guiding products from concept to market at global MedTech and pharma companies. They are also an award-winning engineer with degrees in mechanical engineering and biomedical engineering, and they are also a board member in biomedical engineering at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Nick Hitchins. Great to have you on Beyond the Device.
Thank you very much, and great to be here.
Welcome, Nick. So if you can take us back to where it all began, tell us about early life.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think one of the things I think a lot of people say is that they don't know what they wish to study when they are at university. I would say that for me, that was never a question. From who knows how old, I remember very quickly being convinced that all the conventional things that enter engineering were the things that interested me. Be that the cars that are flying by, the trains that you see, the diggers and things that are on excavation sites and building sites. So from a very young age, I was pretty sure that engineering itself was going to be something that really interested me, just from that pure fascination with things that move and made noise, effectively. And some of that came, with cars and being very interested in cars. So from that side, throughout most of my time, really, I knew that I was going to be heading down towards the engineering route. That then, as I was going through school, became even more prevalent on the basis that I was a person who was diagnosed with dyslexia reasonably early into my life. In fact, I think probably towards the end of primary school, which was reasonably revolutionary at that point, just on the basis that dyslexia wasn't particularly well looked for, and it was purely down to a few teachers that it was lucky enough that I got put in front of someone who was interested in diagnosing people with dyslexia. And this is kind of saying early 90s here, that sort of era when it wasn't as spoke about as much as it is today. Dyslexia is one of those things. Sorry, please go on.
I was just going to touch on that. Compared to nowadays and the school systems and diagnosis, the support there. Can you remember how old you were at that time?
I distinctly remember being in, I think I was probably about 6.
Okay.
The reason I say that is I remember being diagnosed with dyslexia, and the school I was in had no interest in it, absolutely no interest. And I got moved school at 7, so it must have been around that time.
So my mum has just retired from 27 years in teaching in primary schools, which covers that entire period. And my younger sister has dyslexia, and we were talking about it the other day about the school system and how early it spotted the support that's there, the training teachers get. And you would have been at the kind of the wrong end of that when you were diagnosed. So your whole schooling journey, then you were aware of that, and how would that provide any challenges through school academically?
I think it's one of those. I would say I'm classically dyslexic in the fact that I have no issue with reading, but I read a lot slower than most people do. Handwriting is a classic problem. The idea of copying things from boards, from blackboards and whiteboards, is something that is a challenge. It instinctively tilted me away from the subjects where I needed to write large essays or anything like that. So having had this initial early interest in machines and things that move, I then found myself very quickly gravitating towards the subjects that were easier for me, where I didn't have to write long essays. Now that is instinctively then mathematics, physics, things where I can rely upon the equations and the arithmetic and the mathematics within something, rather than having to justify myself in a large written essay.
Yeah, so almost unknowingly playing to your strengths.
Exactly. At that age, I would not have realised that it would benefit me. It did create an issue. Like, I would consider myself as an adult someone with a real interest in history, and you know, I live in a very old part of London, and there's a lot of local history I find very interesting. But at school level, there was not a chance I was going to pick history because I would have to write essays, and that would never work. So I was sort of things like that, where you go, well, that did preclude me from making something that I could theoretically enjoy quite a lot, or I can enjoy the non-essay version of it.
So this early interest in things that move the engineering side, and how that actually linked very well to practically getting involved academically, was that then encouraged by parents, these teachers that you mentioned? Were you kind of then pushed in that direction, or guided that direction?
Yeah, and I think parentally, both my parents, my father was a vet and my mother was a biochemist and academic. So neither of them really had any interest in engineering, or any reason to push me towards engineering. But both of them recognised that engineering was a pretty good subject to study. There was no reason. The fact that I was doing well in mathematics and physics was good enough for them to be that it was, a good subject to be involved in. School-wise, it's the classic thing that slightly alienates you from some of your peer group. It's not cool to be interested in maths. I mean, we've all grown up in the British education system, right? That goes without saying. So it does you no favours.
You find your people.
You do. But as you both know, it's the things that make you popular at school are not maths. It's football. It's drama. It's things like that potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
as you then progress through primary school, secondary school, and then into further education and university, like as I said there, finding your people and others that have a genuine passion and skill for those subjects. At what point did you then see this being an interest to then a career?
Yeah, so I think towards the end of my GCSEs, I remember reasonably clearly a mathematics teacher saying, well, you have to, if you want to do A-level maths, it's that point when people start to talk about careers, start to talk about how you're going to get into university, what you're going to study. And I remember saying, oh, well, I'm pretty sure I want to do an engineering of some form. And I remember a maths teacher who wasn't particularly pleasant, but I do remember him just saying, well, that means you have to get a good grade in maths, full stop. And I remember going, oh, yeah, actually, I've got paying attention then. That means I've got to, I can't coast it. I've got to actually just make sure I get a good grade in maths. Physics, it wasn't necessarily as obvious as that, but just particularly I remember that maths teacher. And at that point, I don't think I knew an engineer. I don't remember knowing anyone. But what I do remember is my first year of A-level mathematics. A-levels mathematics at the time was split into sort of the core mathematics, which is very theoretical. And then there was a series of mechanics modules, which is basically the first foray into the engineering world. And the mechanics modules were taught by the deputy headmaster, who was reasonably fierce at my school, but had been an engineer in the oil industry for quite a long time, and actually was from Pembroke College, Cambridge, was where his degree was from. And I remember walking into his class thinking, God, the only time I've interacted with this guy before is when he caught me smoking, and I got I got Smokers Reform detention. So pretty much my only interaction with him pre this point. And but I remember him being an absolutely brilliant teacher. He was very on the very much on the practical examples. He would bring stuff in to explain the mechanics principles. And it was in his, as a teacher, he was teaching a subject that he practiced for quite a long time. He was a practicing engineer before he became a teacher. So I will always remember that from him. I also remember the other thing I remember from him was he had retired from engineering, become a teacher, bought a house in France, and basically lived in France when he wasn't teaching at the school. So, I probably lived in a flat around the corner, but his main house was in France. Like, he'd had a car with a French number plate. And I was sort of thinking, do you know what? He's done all right out of engineering. So there was a little bit of me that just went, actually, do you know what? That might be a viable option as something to do. Anyway, yeah, so from that side, it really... I was pretty set on I was going to study engineering. At that point, the thing that was taking me there was cars, trains, planes, things that moved. Therefore, I was pretty keen on, I was like, right, well, it's got to be, if engineering, the base engineering is split into civil engineering and mechanical engineering, right, at basic level, and electronics, obviously. I was rubbish. That wasn't my forte. And buildings weren't really my forte. It was very much the things that moved, and therefore that pretty much decided for me that I needed to apply to do mechanical.
Nice.
And what we tend to find is, maybe not in the moment, but when you look back, you find that there's a pivotal moment, a turning point in your life that almost sets you on the trajectory and perhaps gets you where you are today. What is your moment?
Yeah, so I think from that point, I knew I was doing engineering. And then moving forward through my degree, I was very much enjoying engineering in itself as mechanical engineering. And during my degree, we did a placement year. And I got sent to do a placement year in just outside Manchester in Cheshire. And I remember not thinking an enormous amount about what option I was going to do for the placement year. There were loads of companies that offer these things. And I went for an interview and got a job at a place that was a big hydraulics manufacturer. They had about 1,000 staff. A lot of them were assembly line people. They had about 15 in the engineering department. Joined this company, and within a month, I was like, this isn't very interesting. This is lots of big bits of custom metal, and they made custom hydraulic cylinders. So, the lifting equipment, the hydraulic cylinders that go in the back of bin trucks, that sort of thing. And I was thinking, this is very old technology. The Victorians invented hydraulics. This company is, manufacturing loads of them and doing well and a good business, but it was not interesting as an engineer.
Mm.
And so I just remember thinking, this is about as bored as I've been in my life. How can this be the sort of job that I want to go after? And shortly after that, so while I was working in this job, so it's a few months, I'd probably been in it a few months. I had an entire year there, and I was thinking, this is not that interesting. We got sent a booklet on what are we going to do for our final year project, because obviously we're going back to university, you've got to do your final year, you've got a final year project. And I remember flicking through this booklet, seeing a particular professor who was posing a huge number of medical-based projects. And the item, I remember turning onto a few pages, and I was working in a hydraulics company, we were dealing with a lot with the hydraulic pumps. So I had a pretty good knowledge of the hydraulic side of engineering, of the fluid mechanics side of engineering. And I turned over a few of these pages, and there was a professor working on blood pumping devices, particularly implantable blood pumping devices. And he was talking about some of the optimizations. How do you characterize the flow of blood within these pumps while they're in a patient? And it stuck with me a little bit, and I went, oh, hang on a minute, that's quite interesting. I had done biology A-level, so I had a little bit of biological knowledge I had parents who were both in the biology world, and I thought, well, that's quite interesting. That's an application of what I am interested in, engineering, but in something where there's a bit more of an easy traceable benefit, a bit more of something that's just a little bit of a quirk. And so so that for me I found very interesting. I messaged that professor at some point, and when I met him, we discussed quite a few of the projects he had. And I thought, this could be really interesting. Maybe I should do this as my final year project. And I did pick one of his projects to do as my final year project, which was really interesting. I worked on the blood mechanics of, so it was modelling the flow of mechanics so that we could benefit from that flow in order to not let blood cells be damaged by propellers in these pumps. So it was basically just an enormous series of mathematics. But then again, we had to do a series of experiments to try and prove it. But it was really interesting. It was just that idea of, can we move the red blood cells out of the path of the propeller? And it is something you can do. But it was really interesting, and it sort of piqued my interest. And I think maybe halfway through that year, maybe a bit more, I started to think, well, this is interesting. How do I get more into this? What is it? What even is the route from this? Because at this point, I had only really been interested in engineering on a basis of the cars and trains and planes type basis, or the more conventional mechanical items. And he said to me, "Oh, do you know what? There's a professor you should talk to who specialises completely in this, and he does loads more of the same." Who he gave me the email address of. I emailed him, and he said, "Come and do the masters with me. I will sign you up, and let's do the masters together." And I remember sitting in his room saying, "I don't know if this is a good idea. I'm an engineer, and I'm going to specialise so quickly in my final year of university. Suddenly, step out of conventional engineering." And this new professor, a guy called Kim Parker, who is very renowned in his field, he said, "Come and do this masters with me. It will never stop you going backwards." He said, "Nothing that you don't learn here isn't completely applicable to any car, train and plane you'll ever see." And he said, "You can do two options now. You can go and study the turbine of a power plant, and if you improve that by 0.1%, you'll be a billionaire overnight." And he said, "If you do that," he said, "which means it's impossible to do. If it was possible, someone's already done it." He said, "Or you can come and join me, and we can improve these sort of pumping devices by 30-40% every single time we make a change to them." And so that then really piqued my interest. And I was like, hang on, okay, so I can make massive strides in what is quite an emerging industry. So I went and joined him, and at that point I have never turned around, because then I did that year with him, and I was like, hang on a minute, this is the best thing I've ever done. I then went and worked. He introduced me to his old PhD student from 30 years before, who is head of mechanical assist pumps in the Royal Brompton Hospital. And then I ended up working in the Royal Brompton for a bit at that point, we had got to this point where we could put a stethoscope head onto the chest of a patient with one of these pumps implanted, and use the high frequency audio that we recorded from that to determine how the pump was functioning within them. So a conventional stethoscope head with a fairly high quality microphone in the top of it. And we could, from that, look into the high frequencies, so 22,000 hertz and above, and see the blade passing frequencies of the blades within the device in real time on this patient's chest. And that's a patient in clinic in the Royal Brompton. And they're sitting, breathing, talking to you when you're thinking, I am actually seeing how the blades are moving in the pump in the middle of your chest right this present moment in time on the screen. So that was really interesting. That was really interesting.
So just
yeah, sorry.
So just thinking, so going back to your obviously gap year and working in hydraulics, like I'm just thinking about how you'd be feeling if you were there doing a placement year and then finding it boring and thinking, what have I done? This is not what I want to do. You almost feel like it's a wasted year, wasted opportunity. And I imagine along with the boredom, there must have been other feelings that you were feeling at that point. What else was going on?
Yeah, exactly. I definitely at the time did feel like I felt like I didn't know what I was doing there, and that was, I think, one of those. I remember at the time thinking, this isn't really what I want to do, and they were very keen. They were a company who wanted some engineers. They wanted to use that year to assess people and then try and offer them permanent jobs. And I remember them saying, we're thinking we might offer you a permanent job. Would you come back? And I remember driving home that night thinking, well, how do I tell this person who's my boss, no, I never want to go and do this again, So I actually cannot remember what I eventually ended up saying to him, but I said some sort of, "Oh, that's very nice," but I'm afraid I think I might. I'm thinking of doing something. I think I actually based it on geography. I think I said, actually, I would like to go back to London, and I've seen a master's or something. I didn't tell him any more information than that, but I definitely felt
he knows now.
Sorry, he knows now. Exactly.
He knows now.
I'm sure he's long retired now. That was 2008, maybe 7, 8, that sort of era. So I remember driving home and thinking, well, there's not a chance in hell I am staying here, no matter what. Whatever the option is, I just cannot be doing that for the rest of my life. Yeah.
And you obviously found medical through something that just appeared, but from that point, did it get you thinking, right, I now need to find out what I need to do? Like, what was your next step? What was the influence of that on what you then did?
Yeah, and that's I found myself then at the Royal Brompton working with patients, which was very enjoyable, but it's not an easy life at all. At no point of working in the NHS is easy. You don't get paid well. You fight for funding, particularly as someone who's not a standard member of staff. If you're not a doctor or a nurse, you are fighting for funding every single day. Whether you're making an impact clinically or not, you're not getting funding. And there were so many, like my boss there was like constantly arguing why we needed to keep the department alive. You could say, look, this is, you've got a couple of hundred patients here who are not well, and you can see the impact the results of the work we do has, but that doesn't change the funding. They are trying to cut funding continually. So I knew I wouldn't be able to stay in that job. As much as it was nice, it wasn't a workable option. I moved to go and work, and at that point I was starting to look into more of the commercial side, because again at this point I wasn't really working in the commercial side of the medical device industry. I was working in the sort of research side. And I remember I had a girlfriend at the time who was Irish, wanted to. We were both living in London, wanted to move back to Ireland, I think, or she was sort of saying she was. And I did what I would say is the classic thing, is I said, well, in my back of my head, I was thinking, there's not a chance in hell I can get a job in Ireland. No one has a job in Ireland. That's ridiculous. So I said to her, well, why don't we both apply to some jobs? And if the location matches, both London and Ireland, and we can move whichever. I applied to one job in Ireland and got it. And I was like, crap. I've been played at my own game here. So I went to work in the orthopedics industry, in the surgical orthopedics industry, but on the commercial side, which was very interesting. I mean, that relationship died rather quickly. I made the move to Ireland, and it pretty quickly did not really work out at the end of the day. Probably should have guessed that one.
Sounds like a big turning point, that.
Yeah, well, exactly, that's it. But it gave me a real foray into the commercial side of medical device.
Yeah.
So there were people I worked with in that time who I still talk to today. I can't remember what year this is, but probably 2011, that sort of era.
Yeah, I was looking at your profile for the kind of organisations that you work for, dating back to that era, and a bit of time in consultancy with Team, but some startups.
Yeah, so it was pre that. Yeah. Well, I was in that job in Ireland, and I knew I needed to leave it. Just, I think I knew I wanted a change of scenery. I can't quite remember why. Like, I'd made loads of really good friends in Dublin, but I knew I needed a change of scenery. I got a job offer from Medtronic, which was in Galway. And I thought, hang on a minute, am I really moving that much further away from the UK, further away from everyone I know? It's not just Dublin, which you can get back to London in 4 hours from my flat in Dublin. And that was when I got offered a job at Team Consulting. I went for an interview there. I knew I had a job at Medtronic, and I went to an interview there and said, I've got a job at Medtronic, but I don't want to move to Galway. And so purely by the fact that I knew I was looking for another job, I got that job at Team, which was brilliant.
Nice. So what we want to explore, or maybe just delve into a bit deeper, is some of the tools and habits behind you as an individual that have got you to where you are in your career, and from Team into some other startups, into C-suite roles, and that there's been moves, there's been changes, and there's probably been some challenges. We won't release this episode on World Mental Health Day, but we are recording it on World Mental Health Day. So on the subject, are there any strategies, tools, or practices that you use, whether they may be consciously or subconsciously, to manage your mental health?
Persistence probably is the strongest one. Like, I've been quite convinced that I need to be quite persistent with what I've been trying to achieve. In terms of managing it, I would say I find myself very quickly falling into the concept of convincing myself that I need to do something about something. Like when something is bothering you, when you're in that position, or when I'm in that position of, and I find myself quite quickly being, okay, this is something that is causing you to lose sleep at night, causing you to obsess about, then being quite convinced that I need to change something about it and talking myself into it. I'm the perfect sort of person for talking to myself a lot, and therefore I can talk myself, I think, into quite a few of these items.
Do you take action quite quickly then, do you think?
I think I'm a real measured change person. I like change, but I like to measure it out and dwell on it quite a lot before I do. I would say that once I have made the decision, I will be quite quick to enact it. Yeah. But it can take me a while to convince myself to do that.
So is there any examples of that, where a decision you've mulled over and you've made that has either gone well or not gone well? Because we can all make decisions and regret them, but you've made your bed at that point. Is there any examples?
Yeah. So in 2019, I started my own business, actually with someone I worked with in Ireland. We started a nerve stimulation company. And what we were doing, he and I had both worked with an organisation years before who had a patent for stimulating the vagal nerve, which runs down the middle of the body, but from the arteria branch, which is within your ear. Now, there are nerve stimulators that people fit within the chest, and they are shown to have quite large effects. But we had seen this technology where you could do it on the ear, and we had an option to option this patent. I was working for a startup at the company running their technical department. I'd just done with them a full development ramp up, and I felt like it was a possibility to leave. This was a place where Nathan was working with Samantha Shelley, who I know is a friend of both of us. And we got this option to test the technology. And I remember being with him, and we were sort of talking through it, and we were thinking, do you know what, if we can get someone to fund this would be an amazing opportunity. And this is a piece of technology that has been shown to improve depression, been shown to treat cluster headaches. And we're just using a non-pharmacological intervention and a different method. And I do remember in that case thinking about that for months and thinking I was thinking this might be an only opportunity I get to try something as crazy as starting my own med device company. We started it in the summer of 2019. We got some funding through the US, a small amount of funding. We then got some patients we could work with in King's College Hospital. We started a small patient study, and both of us were doing consultancy on the side to try and keep this going. We're taking no money out of the business. And as we got through 2019, data was all looking good. Getting into the start of 2020, I think you might know where this is going. And at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, of course, we were no longer allowed to practice with any patients. And the organisation that were funding us in the US ended up pulling that funding because they had committed to too many things, all this sort of thing. So he and I were suddenly in the early days of the pandemic, business collapsing around our ears. And I remember that just being those first few months of the pandemic, being stuck at home, stuck on the phone to him, working all hours of the night, going, my God, how am I gonna keep this house running? Luckily I sort of pivoted to doing a lot of private consulting work at that point. But my God, watching that company crumble around my ears was definitely a wake-up call of how hard running a business is, but how hard getting funding into startup really is.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I'd really need to consider a lot of the business side of the med device world.
So before we just move on to some reflections, because it's a really interesting example that I'm sure so many people can relate to around that COVID period, whether they'd started a business, were in a role and were at risk, furloughed, all of these different things. So many emotions attached to that. So thinking about that mental health piece, how did you handle those few months when the business was suddenly at risk and everything else that was attached to that, your home?
Do you know, I would say my best word for that is badly. At
Really?
that point in time, it was an obsessive attitude to solving the problem. I had lost sometimes the total night's sleep.
Yeah.
I was taking myself out of the bedroom somewhere else because I couldn't wake everyone else up. You can't wake your partner up in the middle of the night just because you're obsessing about something. I went through so many nights of complete no sleep. I think it took me, I think it might have been 2 months in from that point, maybe, of just losing sleep, having to try and, I was starting to do things like stuck in your home office, and I would do things like going, okay, it's 10 a.m. I'll do an hour of sleep now because I've not slept all night, basically. So really badly, I would say, is how I handled that part of that time.
And with your business partner, sorry to jump in there, with your business partner, you were leaning on each other, but was there anyone else that you were leaning on for support during that time?
Yeah, so at the time, do you know what? And this is an enormous failure of mine at that time. At that time, I was leaning on no one else at that point. I was talking to him continually, but otherwise, I was not telling anyone. I mean, like people who've known me my entire life, I didn't tell, and just because. And I think that was one of those things about that particular point in time is I wasn't seeing anyone because we were, as in physically, you were locked away, right? In the start of the COVID pandemic. So it was easy to not tell anyone. People were texting you, but that doesn't, you don't see anything in a text, do you? So I think at that point I was really badly just refusing to even open my mouth to anyone. And it was, he was the only person we were talking about it with, and that was a relief to be able to have one person that I was sharing that situation with. But he also, didn't live anywhere near me. There was no chance of us meeting up in person. It was just us on the phone. And it wasn't till I remember getting through it with the skin of my teeth of just obsessing about it. And then one day, the two of us just saying, do you know what? We can't do this. Whether we do this again in 6 months' time, whether we try again another time, but we can't take it now. Luckily, I started doing a lot of consultancy work for other people, and I muddled through it. And then it wasn't for probably a year after that point that I started talking to a counsellor about it and talking through, do you know what, this is what it was, and that's what happened over that period of time. But I completely shut. I just closed it, and it was probably a terrible thing to do, and it is a terrible thing to do, really, isn't it? But just totally closed off.
I think it was such a new time for everyone. Nobody had experienced that thing before, so maybe not talking to people. Everyone's dealing with COVID first and foremost, and you don't know what was going on in everyone else's household. So maybe holding that within because you didn't want to disturb other people with that problem. But on reflection, it probably would have been a great thing to do, and probably has now with the time and the counselling that you've had. If you reflect on that, if you were to be going through something quite difficult now, do you open up and share? Have you got people that you could lean on if situations like that happened again?
That is exactly the change, and I think the thing that I learned the most from going through that was this idea that sitting and thinking about something. If you think a lot of my previous life, when a problem has presented, my attitude to it had been sit and think about it for a long time. And by thinking about it by yourself for a long time, you will reach an answer. This was probably the first time where that wasn't the case. Or, as in, this was the point where that activity could not deliver the result. So, looking back on it, it was a terrible way to handle the problem. And now I'm in a very different position. Now I'm not running that business anymore, but also I'm dealing with problems. I now understand how important it is to share and talk about these sort of things when you are in that situation. And I recognize that it is not something that it is not something that obsessively focusing upon can fix that problem. It is external factors that put us in the position we're in, and no amount of thinking about it is going to fix that problem. So, it's definitely a learning I've taken away from that is the real need to... I think the other thing in that particular moment in time was I hadn't been exposed to starting a company before. Therefore, when things were going wrong, I wasn't thinking, do you know what, maybe other people have been here before. I was thinking, oh my God, how am I the first person to let a company fail? That was how my mind was thinking, right? So, but looking back on that now, you go, well, that was madness because...
That makes no sense, yeah.
Yes, exactly. You look how many companies have closed over the years, But I was so obsessed in my own, and I was sitting in the same office for 12, 14 hours a day, right, in my home. And just convincing myself more and more and more that I was the first person to experience this, and therefore I can't possibly share it with anyone else because no one else would understand. And the true reality of it is that's absolute, bollocks, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But so from that basic thing, and I think that's something I've learned a lot from more recently, is that the reality of the problems you have, people have experienced them before. However, even if they're not identical, they match. There's a connection between issues that by talking to someone, they might say, "Oh, actually, that's similar to this," and someone, and it's that chain reaction from sharing the experience.
So looking forward then to the future, what's in store for you personally, professionally, if you were to split them out?
Professionally, I am pretty happy in the company that I'm in at the moment. We are growing our production. We've got a product on market. We are getting to this point where our sales are increasing quite a lot. We're starting to ramp up our production numbers. We're starting to look profitable as a company, which is really valuable. And actually, a lot of those experiences from the past have enabled me to look at this business and go, do you know what? Actually, some of these problems we have are maybe not as big an issue as they could be, or the fact that you can sort of go, well, actually, we might have a problem on our production line today, but our business is still fine. Our business is still healthy. We're still in a good position. I still, looking into the future, I still think from a business point of view, I would kind of still like the idea of one day starting a business again. I mean, it was possibly one of the hardest things I've ever tried to do. But
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Are you going to go back there?
Unfinished business.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing about the particular technology we were working with at that point in time, someone has kind of done it now. Not quite the same way, but they've sort of done a very similar thing. And we no longer have an option on that patent as well. But do I still like the idea of starting something? Yeah, definitely.
But this time, share your problems.
Yeah, exactly. But also, I think I'm still would be very cautious about it. The thing you mentioned personally as well, I think I'm at that particular. I think there is a real importance doing something like that with the sort of separation of church and state. And by that, I mean separating the business from your home life. Because at that point when I started that, it became all consuming. It was about the only thing I could think about for however long it was going on. I ignored my poor partner, Charlotte, completely, So there's that problem, but also there's the problem of risk in that I could have been at risk of losing the house at that point. As in, at some point I would not have been able to pay the mortgage. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons it became such an obsession to me, was because you're sort of sitting there and going, actually, mid-COVID, how much, that point in COVID, how much savings did we have? We hadn't had that house that long. You were like, how long is it until we're actually not going to be able to pay for this house? So if I was to do it again, and I hear stories of people who say, oh, well, I remortgaged the house to do that company. And I was like, well, you're braver than I am. I mean, how? You're really risking the roof over your head for that. So I think those are things I would be really, really cautious about doing again. But also, now I share with Charlotte much more than I did at that point in time. I was pretty much ignoring her in those months. Obviously, she was working as well. But I couldn't go through keeping all that information in the way that I did at that point.
It feels like you've really grown through those experiences, and so many lessons that even I'm taking from this conversation. I think when you're going through something, you then attach emotions to it as well, and maybe the point that stops you from sharing is maybe a little bit of embarrassment or shame around it. You think, oh, like you said, am I the first person to ever have a company that's gonna fail? Of course you're not, but they're irrational feelings that then just build up, and as soon as you let off that steam and speak to someone, it helps because you're getting an external view on a problem that can just cut through all of the stuff that's going through your head and make it sound quite a simple thing.
Exactly. And I think it was a real kick. Pre that point, I'd never been in that position. And I don't just mean I hadn't started my own business before. I had done reasonably well at school. I'd done reasonably well at university. I'd got a job pretty much straight out of university. I'd then moved from one job to another. I'd not been made redundant at any point. I'd had a series of experiences where things had gone pretty well, right? I have 2 younger brothers. I was sort of always the one who seemed to be doing okay, and suddenly that experience, I was sitting there going, hang on a minute, suddenly I'm not doing okay. How can I tell my younger brothers, my mother, all these rest of things? And it's exactly as you're saying there. It's like this, it's sort of a mixture of embarrassment. It's a mixture of not wanting to admit to yourself that you're in a position where this couldn't go okay. And I found myself, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning telling myself, I can't let this fail. I've got to be able to think my way out of a position where this doesn't fail. And, I can't face the failure that sits there. And so that was the thing of just convincing yourself that I can't turn around and accept that this is something that didn't work.
Yeah.
And I can't, even telling someone that it's going badly would be part of the admitting that something's not working.
Almost makes it real.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the vulnerability to have that conversation, we talk about it all the time. Opportunities are connected to people. Solutions are connected to people. Action and progress is connected to people. And as soon as you start to have those conversations, you will find a path forward and look where you are now.
Yeah.
So if it go on.
Sorry. It's that I actually think, having now done however many years of counselling, I did post that. I mean, bearing in mind I'm still doing 1 or 2 counselling sessions a year. There is an obsession, or I found that there is like a strength in vulnerability thing that I definitely didn't have at that point in time, which was that by locking everything inside, you think that you're showing strength. But actually what you're doing is saying, I'm too weak inside to be able to tell someone else this because my house of cards will crumble when I start to tell other people this problem. Whereas once you get to that point of saying, actually, do you know what, I can tell other people and and that's okay. That's an element of strength that is very, very different, I think.
Yeah, and I was going to ask if you were to summarise one key lesson from your journey. I mean, that would be a great one. If you've got another key lesson that you'd leave the listeners with, what would that be?
I think there is a huge amount of strength in trying something, but there's also a huge amount of strength in accepting that something's not going well, or accepting that sometimes you've tried something and it's not worked. And I think that definitely is what I took away from that experience, and it's something I'd recommend anyone is, by all means, try something. I think people should try stuff, and take the risk, as it were, but know what the backup plan is, know what when it goes wrong, putting your hands up and saying, yeah, it didn't go right, and that's fine. And it's something I remember a lot from a friend of mine who started a company straight out of university. And I think it ran for 5 years or so, and then it didn't work. And they went, oh, it's a failure. And at the time I was like, oh, that's such a shame. But I didn't appreciate that actually. Looking back at it now, I go, yeah, but you started something straight out of university. That's incredible. And yeah, okay, it failed. But Christ, did you not learn so many useful things? So yeah, if I was going to leave a message, that would probably be my part of my message, would just be that try it, and if it doesn't work, that's good, that's fine, that's not a problem. And that's something I think also in potentially in this country we're not so good at. We think everything should work perfectly, everything should go perfectly.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I've loved that conversation, and thank you for
thank you,
being
Nick.
vulnerable on this call and sharing some of those stories and insights. And we just invite our listeners to reflect on their own turning points. And if you think you've got a story to tell, please contact Nathan or I, and we can look at bringing you on as a future guest. But for now, please like, share, and subscribe to the Beyond the Device channels, and we look forward to bringing you more guests very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.